Welcome to California in Focus. I'm David Mastio, and today we're talking about the California Environmental Quality Act and reforms that have been proposed by the Little Hoover Commission. Joining me today is the Center Square's Kenneth Schrupp, California reporter. Kenneth, what's going on?
Hey, David. There's this law that was passed in the 1970s called the California Environmental Quality Act that allows pretty much anyone to hold up construction of a building or development so long as they can keep challenging the construction on environmental grounds. There have been a lot of non-environmental challenges used for this law. For example, in Berkeley, people were called pollution. So they said, look, more humans are a form of pollution, therefore having more people will be a problem. There have been a lot of non-environmental applications of this law. So the Little Hoover Commission, obviously noting that there's a major housing shortage in California, some estimates say there's a 4.5 million home housing shortage, issued some recommendations to amend CEQA that would allow for the construction of more housing. This is notable because the Little Hoover Commission is a non-partisan, state-funded, independent oversight agency. And so its recommendations are taken rather seriously, about the same level as that from the Legislative Analyst's Office. The LHC found that CEQA is heavily used for non-environmental goals and recommended, among other things, to exempt infill housing from CEQA review. That is, if there already are structures and housing in an area on the lot, then they're not going to require a new review process if you're going to replace that. And then they're also going to require greater standing to indefinitely challenge new construction, because now pretty much anyone in the country can file a CEQA complaint, even if they're not local to the area. They could be in a different state, even alleging some kind of environmental misdeed or incomplete review that can just let development go on and on. And these development times are important because development time is really how long it's going to take, how much interest you have to pay on loans as a developer until you can start selling your project or selling your units. Developers tend to borrow almost all the money that they've used for projects. So if you have a state with a really long construction and permitting time like California, where it takes 626 days for a house builder to get a construction permit in San Francisco, that means that you as a developer are paying the highest cost wherever it takes longest to get the turnaround for your projects, which means you're not going to want to build in somewhere like California, even if the potential payoff is high from extremely high amounts of demand and capital here.
So CEQA has been abused is essentially what the Little Hoover Commission is saying. Among their recommendations is that judges go from having 2 days of annual training in how CEQA works to 5 days of annual training. Is this a horrendously complicated law?
Now it is. It was passed as a very simple bill in the 70s, but over time the case law has become incredibly complex for the issue.
Among the recommendations that the Little Hoover Commission made is that infill housing be allowed without CEQA review. What is infill housing and how big of a deal is that?
Infill housing is somewhere where you already have buildings and housing built. So if you are in a residential neighborhood that already exists, then and you just want to build a new house on a lot that already has a house on it, you're not going to have to go through CEQA review again. That means that you'd still have CEQA review if you're building a new subdivision out somewhere where you're in the wilderness, hacking away at the mountains, or even like you buy a piece of land in Malibu that doesn't have any structures on it and you want to build a house, you're going to have to go through CEQA. But otherwise, if there's something already there, you'll be able to avoid the CEQA review process. That would be huge for the state.
Another one of the recommendations is that the legislature should require CEQA to limit the submission of public input to the actual public comment period. So what I understand is that people who want to build a house have to take public comment on it and react to the public comment and work that into their CEQA review, but there's no limits to how long people can keep adding comments and complaints?
It's sort of blackmail, the way that people who want to challenge something on the basis of CEQA approach this. If a big enough interest group wants to make a comment past the comment period, the developer will probably want to respond to that or otherwise face more challenges under CEQA grounds from that group until the project is either built and they reach some form of agreement, or that powerful interest decides to stop anything from being built by that group in that place forever, and they move on.
So tell me a little bit more about the Little Hoover Commission. It's probably the place in California government where Republicans have the most power because they have half of the partisan seats.
Sure. The Little Hoover Commission is an independent state oversight agency where, as you've noted, Republicans have some of the most control of anywhere in the state government. This is especially important for them and Californians for balance because about 70% of the Little Hoover Commission's recommendations have been partially or fully adopted by the state of California through the legislature and the governor. Something else worth noting is the even number of Republicans and Democrats on the Little Hoover Commission, which means that there has to be a high degree of bipartisan agreement and support for recommendations to make it out of the Little Hoover Commission.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation that California has a 4 million unit shortage of housing. This Little Hoover Commission report and their recommendations are only one piece of a multifaceted approach to dealing with that. Can you tell me some of the other things that are going on in California to try and deal with the housing shortage?
There are ways in which the state is trying to fund the construction of more housing for homeless individuals through grants that subsidize the cost of construction. There is something called inclusionary zoning that a lot of cities have adopted where you get a density bonus where you're allowed to build more units on a piece of property if you decide to adopt price controls on rent and income controls for who's allowed to live there based on how much money they make relative to area median income. These are not considered to be effective tools. The Turner Center for Housing at Berkeley did an analysis on inclusionary zoning and found that for every home that's produced as a result of inclusionary zoning, in the absence of inclusionary zoning controls, there would have been, I believe it was 5 or 10 market rate units that would have been built otherwise, which does suggest that you are significantly reducing the overall supply to create a politically acceptable housing solution that benefits a very limited number of people at the expense of everyone else.
So you're saying that we're going to be talking about housing for years to come?
I mean, California builds about 100,000 homes a year. California has, depending on who you ask, anywhere from a 3.5 to 4.5 million home housing shortage. So yeah, 35 to 45 years to meet current demand. That's assuming that demand does not grow. We're looking at a very long housing shortage here.
Kenneth Rupp, thanks for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.